today, I guess, for me is an opportunity to share some of my thoughts on nature in the city, which is a subject that I think about quite a lot, being very interested in nature and living in the city. And a nice opportunity for me too to show some of the photos that I've taken over the last few years, which I think go quite nicely with the topic of nature in the city. The thing that interests me the most about nature and the city, I think, is that often when we talk about nature and cities, people kind of seem to almost place them at opposite extremes. And when we think about nature, we think about wilderness and pristine areas. And when we think about the city, we think about artificial structures and things that have been created by humans. But I think it's quite important to make the point that nature and the city aren't actually at different extremes. They really are the same thing, excuse me, looked at in a different way. And I kind of struggle with the whole concept that humans can do unnatural things. And so when I look at a city, even though at first glance it might seem sort of artificial and unnatural, when you relate it back to the fact that everything has been created by humans, then it can't be unnatural, because humans are natural creatures. So just as worms dig burrows through the soil and dung beetles make little round balls of dung that they move around, humans do the same things, but with different materials and on a different scale. And so I think it's really interesting to look at cities in that different light and to appreciate them as being natural creations. I think we've kind of allowed our cities to become degraded spaces, and through that we kind of don't appreciate the natural aspects of them, and then what that does is creates like a burning need for a lot of people who live in cities to escape the city and to go somewhere wild and natural and pristine, to try and find that other end of that sort of perceived spectrum. And in the process, ironically enough, we make the pristine areas less pristine by our presence. And we almost, by doing that, I feel anyway, justify the fact that our cities are degraded spaces. So the very act of escaping the city to go somewhere beautiful to sort of remedy the malaise that we get from being in the city sort of perpetrates the whole problem, because we end up degrading natural spaces and we end up justifying the degradation of our actual cities. So when I think about nature and the city, I think about how nature interacts with the city. And when I say nature in that respect, I guess I'm talking about plants and animals and natural processes. And I also think about how the city interacts with those natural processes. So, for example, when we get rain coming down out of the sky, and this is pure water that's been evaporated from the Pacific Ocean and floated in clouds across the countryside, where it's come to a point where it cools down enough and recondenses, and then this pure little drop of water comes down out of the sky and hits a footpath in a city, and within a really short space of time goes from being a really pure little raindrop to having a myriad of different contaminants contained within it. And then typically the journey proceeds down the nearest gutter into the stormwater system, which all ends up in the nearest stream or river, where a lot of those contaminants will fall out of the water and land in the sediment. Many of them will be absorbed into other creatures living in that waterway, and some of them will be carried out into the ocean. So that's an interesting way of looking at how nature interacts with the city, where you can get something pure coming into the city, becoming contaminated, and then sort of leaving the city again. And within that short space of time of being in the city, it's picked up those things. And it's the same with leaves falling off trees. You know, trees are mining amazing nutrients from the soil and the subsoil, and bringing them up to the surface, and then either all the time or every autumn, dropping all of these amazing leaves full of carbon and nutrients and minerals onto the ground. And typically what happens with a street tree in a city is that they all end up on the footpath or in the gutter. And the same thing happens again. You know, all of the contaminants that have come out of people's exhaust pipes, that have worn off the rubber tread on people's cars, all of that kind of thing is sitting there in the gutter waiting for the leaves to come and mingle with it. And then you get this amazing product turned into something which you wouldn't really want to use. So naturally I'd want to use leaves on my garden. But once they've landed in the gutter, I don't want to use them anymore, because the very process of collecting them up also brings with it those contaminants that have come from the road. So when nature interacts with the city like that, you can get those kind of issues. But the things that I like to think about in terms of nature interacting with the city is like when you walk down the main street in Nelson at sort of 5:30 in the evening, and you get these flocks of birds just all over town in these massive big old plane trees. They're not that old actually, they're only about 16 years old, but they're big trees. And the noise is just incredible. They're just huge colonies of birds, and they fly from tree to tree, and they're almost oblivious of the actual stuff going on in the city below them. All they really care about is that the trees are there for them to hang out in, and I guess too, you know, they're lucky because tends to be lots of food rubbish and that kind of thing left all over the ground that those birds can then go and clean up. So those birds interact with the city in a really beneficial way, and they probably wouldn't necessarily get to have the same quality of life if they were living somewhere wild, because they wouldn't have the same access to the food resource that you find in the city. You know, somebody who's thrown their sandwich on the ground, or there's half a Subway sub in a rubbish bin or something, you know, and that's such a good food source for them. So some of them do really well. And things like pigeons as well, you know, the rats of the skies, which do incredibly well in cities. And so there's lots of things like that interact beneficially with the city. I mean, you know, all you have to do is walk down the street and look underneath some of those big trees, and you see these incredible patterns of bird droppings. And they're concentrated under the tree, and then they sort of dissipate as you move out from the tree. They look really, really amazing. And so what I kind of like to encourage people to do is when you're walking through the city, to look down and look up and look around and see what's happening in that city. You know, it's not just bricks and concrete and steel and glass. There's a whole ecosystem happening there